how many of you have come here before. But if you're first time visitor, please leave your email IDs in this folder that I will just place in the coffee table so that you're on our mailing list. To just introduce Dr. Guha, she is an associate professor of history at the Shivnagar University in New Delhi. Nearly.
Not in
Nearly.
Yes.
She researches on histories of archaeology, museums, heritage making, and has had a long career in curating the photographic collections at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. This particular lecture that she will be delivering this evening will join the chapter of her book Artifacts of History, which is published in 2015, and she is at present writing another book on objects and history that will soon be published. So,
Yes. Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you for introducing me.
And shall I can open the thing and do it myself, right? Yeah, so I can just do it. Well, thanks for coming. I just thought I'll make it simple. I mean, I do work on histories of museums and collections and all, but today I think I'll tell you a story about Bombay. And I think that's probably much more suitable for the place we are in. And this is 19th century Bombay. This is, and it's a story about a couple of antiquities from ancient Assyria which came into the city. And it's a story about that. And it's there in a book chapter. But coming from archaeology and having certain issues with the ways in which archaeologists think about antiquities. I mean, if there were students here, I would have kind of gone on to the spiel about why this is important for thinking through histories of archaeology, but I think I will stop that there. I mean, that would be more of a lecture class. So what you see is the town hall, which used to be the town hall, and it's an old photograph of the Bhauda Jilad. But the story of Nineveh in the 19th century in Bombay, it offers a rare glimpse of the dissemination of the ancient Orient, which is, Orient is the European terminology for anything which is east of the West. So I say it that way because we always bandy the term by using it as Orientalism, but actually William Jones didn't mean it like that. But this is a history of the ancient Orient within the colonized Orient, which is Bombay, of course, and India, and of the powerful agency of antiquities in fashioning aspects of contemporary milieu. And we forget that antiquities, however old they actually allow us to fashion something in the present. And we just need to think about heritage, to think about these issues. The displays in Bombay of the foreign objects of ancient Assyria met local demands of civic amenities, including a building for a museum which was called the Central Museum of Natural History, Economy, Geology, Industry, and the Arts, which was mooted for the city in 1847 and established virtually without a building, operating from the town hall. So that's why the slide. The funds towards the building of this museum were sought throughout during the 1850s, and the building founded today's Bhaudaji, the Victorian Albert Museum and Gardens. Now, these economic museums were established in India by the British from 1840, first in Calcutta, and then in many of the Mufassil towns on the premise, and I quote, "The more we know of India, the more valuable it will become, and there is nothing that we can see more likely to conduce to this desirable acquaintance with this country and its resources than the great establishment of a museum." The story of Nineveh in Bombay draws our attention to the need for knowing more about these economic museums. We know very little about it. We only know perhaps something, thanks to the curators and the curation of Bhaudaji, this is the museum we know most about. They were reference collections of India's tappable resources, and importantly, they represent the transactions between commerce and culture, which continues unabated to date, as we may glean from all the heritage-making endeavors in the present. Now, following the success of the French invasion of Egypt, so this is outside India, 1799, Napoleonic invasion, the biblical geography of Mesopotamia, which is, I can show you a slide here, if you can see the slide, acquired added geographical value during the 19th century as a strategic place or route India from Europe. The beginnings of archaeological excavations in this region actually began with the establishment of a British resident in Baghdad, who was Claudius Rich, who explored the area. And the excavations of Nineveh has a bearing on this politics of the British and the French to actually get a foothold in Mesopotamia. The French followed the creations of the British resident in Baghdad by creating a post of a consul in Mosul. The first consul was Paul-Émile Botta, you see on the slide, and Layard, Botta excavated at Khorsabad. Sorry, I can see an R missing from the Khorsabad. The site is called Dur Sharukin today. And Layard's excavations close at Nimrud followed the exciting promises of Botta's excavation. Austin Henry Layard was a diplomat, a British diplomat, who excavated at Nimrud, thinking this was the biblical Nineveh, between 1845 and 1847, and then from 1850 to 1851. And the cargoes for both Botta and Layard's excavations were loaded at Basra, and they were sent via the sea to Bombay, to Britain and continent, but they came to Bombay. So this is the story. This is how these Assyrian antiquities came to Bombay. Now, between 1846 and 1848, Bombay received at least 3 such shipments. The first arrived in mid-1846, and it was a collection of artifacts that had been picked up by a British merchant called Mr. Hector, that's all we know about him, from a heap which was cast aside as useless by Botta near Khorsabad. We know very little about this collection, apart from the fact that Mr. Hector had sold his collection to the British Museum for £400. And a transport company called Messrs. Derome and Hunter, they shipped this collection to London, coming via Bombay. The collection was possibly displayed in the Grant Road, what is called as the Grant Road buildings in 1846. The history I'm telling you, actually, I've just been able to piece together very sketchily from a journal, which you'll see the mention. So this seems to be the first exhibition of Assyrian artifacts, and we're talking about 1846. And these were the first exhibitions of these ancient artifacts in the modern world. They had never been exhibited before. And we get a glimpse of the exhibition venue from a subsequent report of 1851 in the Bombay Times. It's called the Bombay Times and Journal of Commerce, which recalled the Grant Road building, and I quote, as a swamp theatre surrounded with marshes and burial grounds in which £500,000 of public money was thrown unwisely. The report emphasized that although the building was called a place of public amusement, no one ever went there to be amused. The available report does not tell us who saw the artifacts, how were they perceived. However, in informing us of the highly unsuitable Grant Road buildings, it allows us to anticipate that there would be a demand for a building for the Economic Museum in Bombay. So that's all we actually get from this report. Layard's first shipment to the British Museum, which left Basra in October 1846, was the next to reach Bombay after Hector's collection, and it reached in December 1846. And there's a report of this in the Bombay Times from the 19th of December, which mentions that an exhibition of 29 selected objects were hosted at the initiative of the Bombay branch of the Asiatic Society. This exhibition we know of was held at the library in Kolaba. The exhibition possibly opened on the 19th of December and it closed on the 6th of February 1847, after which the cargo went on its way to London. It was quite specifically aimed, and I quote here, for the benefit of the community of Bombay. And the journalist who made this review, who's actually the marks you see is the journalist's reviews, he called himself JBZZ. So I cannot tell you whether he's British or whether he's Parsi, or I would think he's British, but I do not know. He reported that the exhibits were intensely interesting to all those whose minds are not debilitated from the exercise of power pursuits. he created the understanding of the importance of ancient Assyria for his readers by mentioning this to be the first recorded empire after the flood, which reveals to us that he was schooled in the biblical history of ancient Mesopotamia. And he also saw in the exhibits rosaries in the hands of some of the male figures. So we see that this is a biblical mindset, which is actually making him see certain things in the figures. However, he saw many Indian features in the objects, and he mentions some of them, such as on the arm of a male, an armlet corresponding exactly with those now in use with the lower classes of male Hindus. And he noted that the finely executed heads of horses with the trappings were a better representation of the horse dressings of the Rajas and Sardars of the Deccan, and that the swords the figures held were quite similar to the ones that were then in use with the Mohammedans and the Marathas, being straight, double-edged, and short-handled. And I just wonder if there is a photograph here of the swords. No, just to tell you, this is possibly some of the antiquities which he saw. Now, these descriptions are notable examples of the analogical method which we use in archaeology, through which we instinctively make sense of the unknown. We look at the known to make sense of the unknown. In recalling the exhibition in the Asiatic Society, we recall that Layard and Botha had no precise knowledge of what they had excavated, apart from the strong belief that the discoveries were related to biblical tales and that the antiquities were of ancient Assyria. The finds which they shipped to Europe therefore acquired semantic values upon their arrival in London and Paris, and to a large extent through the sensationalism through which they were received. They were really large objects, and you can see this was a sensational sketch of one of the colossal figures being carted to the British Museum. And you can see it's from the Illustrated London News, 1852, is it? When they came in. Now, the meanings which these Assyrian antiquities accrued in Europe throughout the 19th century, including their identity as remnants of the palaces of the Assyrian kings, were therefore endowed outside the context of their find spots, without a knowledge of the script, which many of them carried upon their surfaces, and through varying and conflicting aesthetic appeal which they fetched from the public and the members of the establishment. In the beginning, they were considered to be great pieces of high art. By the 1850s, and remember, the excavations happened from 1845. Within 5 years, the European world decreed the Assyrian art to be inferior to anything which represented the classical. Richard Westmacott, who actually made the pediment of the British Museum. The British Museum has a pediment, a pyramidical structure on the top, who declared, if we have 1/10 part of what we have of Nineveh art, it would be quite enough as specimens of arts of it because the arts of the Chaldean is very bad art. And that is the attitude they had towards Assyrian art from the 1840s. The Biblical Association, which attended all the meaning-making ventures for the objects, challenged the interpretation of the imagery. And the winged bulls, the massive lions, human heads, obelisks, alabaster vessels came to be called, and I quote here Miriam Brossius, who's written on the objects in the British Museum, misfit objects. They were stored, displayed, and even seen within institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre as materials with historical potentials, but with no actual histories. Therefore, the Indian reception requires a semantic value for noting a different history of aesthetics. And as it has been pointed to me by Frederick Bora, it might be an oppositional aesthetic which came up from the citizens of Bombay. Layard's second cargo reached Bombay in February 1848. And after this cargo went to London in October 1848 and Layard opened it, he and subsequently the British Museum accused the Bombay government of vandalizing this cargo. In fact, in Nineveh and its Remains, which is the book which he wrote after this first series of excavations, it proved to be also a 19th century bestseller. Layard actually pondered over the fate of his shipments. and I quote here, he said, "I could not forbear musing upon the strange destiny of their burdens, which after adorning the palaces of the Assyrian kings, were now to visit India, to cross the most distant seas of the southern hemisphere, and to be finally placed in a British museum. Who can venture to foretell how their strange career will end?" Throughout his life, Layard was to rage about the loss of, and I quote him, "valuable ruins of a great city and of a great nation." And this history of loss has actually enshrined all subsequent histories of the 19th century archaeology of ancient Assyria. So we know that Brian Fagan, who is an archaeologist today, writing about the histories of archaeology in 2007, and I quote him, states, "The cases were opened, the contents were rifled out of curiosity, some of the antiquities were stolen, and even lectures were given on the remains." Now, at the time of the scandal, of the loss of Layard's cargo, this compelled the Bombay government to make a spirited defense. And the government had declared that the only specimen which have suffered are those which were packed at the place where they were excavated, i.e. at Basra. In piecing together the sketchy report of the shipment, we find that the cargo had indeed lain unattended in the Dockland area in Bombay for more than 6 weeks. And this, despite the injunctions of the then Bombay governor, Governor Clerk, who was away from the city during the period of their transit, and he said he wanted it to be set it out for exhibition in the town hall, and he said where each stone was to be accompanied by a description of the character and history of the sculptures it contained. It is also interesting when we look at the Bombay Times and many of these editions that the declaration of the Bombay government was appended by a letter from the captain of the ship in which this cargo was then sent to London. The ship was called H.M. Jamna, and the captain, it set sailed to London from Bombay in April 1848. And the captain had said that a single obelisk with some fragments were shown in Bombay. The rest were at once sent on board as soon as they could be secured. The public saw nothing of them whatsoever. From the reports, we can gather the information that some of the artifacts were indeed exhibited in Bombay, albeit without the formal authority of the Asiatic Society. But I cannot tell you where they were exhibited, probably not in the town hall. We also know, before this cargo came to Bombay in February 1848, 2 months before that, the city of Bombay had got a gift from Henry Creswick Rawlinson. He had given a gift of 10 fine Assyrian slabs to the Governor-General Clark, and Clark donated it to the city of Bombay. This was in December 1847. These slabs were subsequently displayed in the town hall. By 1847, Rawlinson, who had come close to deciphering the Assyrian inscription, had participated in Layard's excavations and had made the compelling argument, which is subsequently revoked as erroneous, that the site Layard was digging was indeed the biblical Nineveh. Rawlinson's gift to Bombay was appreciated locally, and also Rawlinson had made his career in Bombay as a cadet. He rose in ranks from Bombay. So he had an unusual emotive sentiment with the city. And his gift was received by Bombay, or by Governor Clark, as beautiful specimens. And this is possibly, this display in the town hall is possibly the third public display of these ancient Assyrian artifacts in the city. But the displays asks us to think about who saw the objects, and the ones who did see the objects, did they know anything about ancient Assyria? What did they think about? What did the people think about, make of these objects? Now, in searching for answers, we are prompted to inquire into the education of history in India, which was then being imparted by the British. By the 1830s, the British antiquaries of India had established the fact that the natives had no historical texts and were ignorant of the useful sciences of history. The other useful sciences were natural philosophy, botany, geology, grammar, and arithmetic. History was considered to be chronology, and history, they deemed, was the description of things as they are or have been, with a regular account of the principal facts and circumstances. By the 1840s, we find Indians and British jointly undertaking historical investigations, for example, through the Archaeological Society of Delhi, which opened in 1847, which was for a short span till 1854, which revealed the presence of an Indian intellectual milieu that was able to negotiate historical inquiries on the parameters of the Western understanding of history. Notably, this milieu made its formal presence within the learned societies in Bombay at the same time as the Assyrian antiquities came to the city, which adds to the reasons for searching for a curricula of history within Bombay as devised by the British. We know that the first Indian member who was admitted to the Bombay branch of the Asiatic Society was Manikji Karsetji in 1840, and from 1847 we find an incremental increase of the Parsis in the society, but they were only allowed to be as ordinary members. The Journal of the Bombay branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, which was established in 1841, and not the Journal of the Bengal Royal Asiatic Society, carried all newses of the spectacular archaeological discoveries, which were then being made mostly in what we now call as the Middle East, including Layard's excavations of Nimrud. And one can postulate that the antiquaries of ancient Assyria made the antiquaries of Bombay special attention to the histories of the historical connections between India and the West, which were built upon the histories of the Parsi community. So this is also the history of Zoroastrianism comes up. We start seeing them in the JBBRS. Now, unfortunately, when we look out for history books, what one comes across is an early example of the contents of the syllabus actually comes from Calcutta. And it's a bilingual book, textbook, which is probably the first history book in India, which is called, as you can see, An Epitome of Ancient History, containing a concise account of the Egyptians, Assyrians, Persians, Grecians, and Romans. This book has a page of translation in Bengali facing the English text. The Bengali title of this book is Prachin Itihash Shamuchai, and we know that it was aimed for schools in Calcutta and the Hindu College. The text was compiled by James Prinsep, the eminent antiquary by then, and the text comprised 5 chapters of ancient civilizations that were then known to the European world: the Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Mede and Persian, Greek and Roman. And the introduction reminded the young readers, and I quote, "History provided various advantages, of which one was that it lent to amend our lives. Observing the actions which are there recorded, it is our duty to reject what is evil and to adopt that which is good," unquote. Significantly, the chapters drew upon the ruins and the historical landscapes that had been surveyed in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Rome, etc. by the then antiquaries for embellishing this moral of a historical pedagogy. And each chapter concluded with a section which was called Reflections, and you can see that in the last bit of that slide there, which was translated into Bengali as advice, or rather the Bengali translation the English translation of the Bengali is advice, and we may anticipate this section illustrated the lessons from history which the students were required to learn. With respect to the Assyrian civilization, the students were told, and I quote, "Even the walls and gates and bars of Babylon proved of no avail when the period appointed for the destruction of the powerful Assyrian empire had arrived." The chapter listed the catalogue of crimes of the Assyrian kings that had led to the downfall, and the section on reflections reasoned, and I quote, "Whereas the beast of forest preys not upon his own species, myriads of human race have been slaughtered by the hands of their fellow men." The potential propaganda value of the advice to Indian students to the history of Assyrian civilization is quite apparent, which was the advice sows seeds of suspicion within communities. However, the viewing of the Assyrian antiquities in the mid-19th century Bombay tells us precious little about this consumption of this useful pedagogy by the residents. Instead, the histories allow us to note the histories of subversions of cultural, moral, and political valuations, which were considered by the Britishers. Rawlinson's gift possibly motivated the Asiatic Society to push for plaster casts of the pieces from Layard's second shipment, which the captain had talked about, this alabaster pillar. And the history of the plaster casting, this is probably the first instance of plaster casting in India, plaster casting antiquities in India. The history can be gleaned from the Bombay Times of the 12th January 1848, which had emphasized, and I quote, "It is not unworthy to notice that the first of this sort of work executed at Bombay has been so by the Abyssinian boys from the slave ship of Mahi. The abundant presence of gypsum around Bombay probably facilitated the process, and the Asiatic Society mooted the plans with the solid reasoning, and I quote here, "Since the whole collection was public property intended for the information of the people of England, and paid for it, in part at least from the purses of Her Majesty's subjects in India, it was considered expedient that the cost should be taken for it for preservation in Bombay." And the members noted that few of us are ever likely to see it in the British Museum. After it was completed, they also noted that had other specimens now complained of as being broken or destroyed been similarly treated, they might have been readily restored. So the plea for securing replicas of ancient Assyrian antiquities touched upon issues of preservation and attended to the logic of meeting the hopes of the Indians who had funded the British government's excavations and the expenditure of moving these objects from in situ position. It was fully conceived upon procuring examples of ancient Assyria for the city of Bombay, which was then a growing cosmopolis and an international port town. Now, the life histories of these plaster casts are not known, and there is a possibility, however, that the black obelisk, which is this one, of Shalmaneser, may have served as an architectural element within the city. I was informed last year, after somebody read the book by a historian of Bombay, Mr. Vinayak Talwar, that there used to be an obelisk road which ran parallel between the Duncan Road and the Parel Road, and it's called the Grant Road today. And actually, he's given me a map, and I can't open the map here, but there is a map which is catalogued in the Library of Congress in Washington, which shows this obelisk road. Additionally, last year I was, or rather this January, I was in the K.R. Kama Institute, and in the library, there is a possibility that the plaster casts which you are seeing are the plaster casts which were probably made at that point of time. And the casts were donated by the Prince of Wales Museum to the K.R. Kama Institute in 1961. They came via Moti Chandra. But the K.R. Kama Institute during the Second World War was also given the repository of the Assyrian antiquities so that they could be preserved for the war raids. Most museums during the Second World War all over the world hid their antiquities. They preserved their antiquities in separate places. So the Kama Institute was the recipient of that. Now, if indeed the Nineveh marbles from Layard's cargo were used within the city of Bombay for showing off, then it makes sense, because then we could think of Bombay showing the acquisitions of its most spectacular archaeological discovery of the time, albeit in casts, to embellish its growing fortunes as an international port and as a place for cosmopolitan ambience. And this history actually comes up through many aspects which you'll hear about from George Birdwood, who then argued for a museum for the city. Completely outside Bombay, when you see these, many of these Assyrian objects seem to have inspired some of the architectural features of Bombay. These are much later, and the Assyrian objects also inspired the paintings in the Albert Hall in Jaipur. So far beyond. So these antiquities had an objective, or they were used in certain ways whose use we really do not know very well. But in the 1850s, the foreign objects inspired the educated residents of Bombay to keep abreast of the news of the excavations of Nimrud. And after seeing the spectacular topographical maps of Nineveh that were made for the British Museum in 1851, a section of the city's elite demanded civic amenities for Bombay. And they declared, and I quote, "We desire no less for Nineveh, but should like to see the streets and alleys of the metropolis of Western India served and laid down with something like the fullness and precision with which the capital of Assyria is represented." The Assyrian exhibits in the town hall also often inspired unique public lectures, and there is an example of one which was given by a Mr. Beddoes in January 1855 to the accompaniment of a harmonium. Now, the musically scored lecture was no doubt Christian in content, but it was advertised, and I quote here from the Bombay Times, as the highest intellectual treat of the highest order, and it was poised to place before the institution, i.e. the town hall, a sum of money which will aid in helping it towards its infant career of usefulness. This sum of money, what they collected, went in towards the building eventually of what is now the Bhaudaji Lad. The antiquities were specifically evoked for demands towards the building of this economic museum at this point of time in 1850. And in pressing the demands for this museum, this virtual museum, the first curator, George Birdwood, emphasized, and I quote him, "A red and shrewd traveler, recalling the story of Babylon, Nineveh, Tyre, Jerusalem, would naturally anticipate the highest manifestation of intellect within the gates of such an active mart as Bombay. But such a visitor would search in vain for stately streets, theatres, markets, fountains, public offices, museums, and art galleries." Yet, these antiquities did not make it to the Victorian Albert Museums and Gardens when it opened to the public in 1872. Rawlinson's gift, we would think, would have had an easy accommodation within the buildings of this museum. The lofty aims of this museum were, and I quote, "The rich and the poor could meet in pursuit of common objects in the environment of innocent and ennobling pleasures, producing a community of view that is desirable of the mind." So that was why the Victorian Albert Gardens and Museums came up. The antiquities instead seem to have been forgotten within the offices that had made them prominent, which is within the Asiatic Society's building itself. And it's quite significant that in 1891, a Parsi scholar, Rustamji Pestonji Karkaria, he came to notice a few marbles, and I quote him actually, a few marbles lying on the landing place of the Society's office, reclining against the wall near the northern entrance into the hall. Karkaria identified them correctly as Assyrian in origin, which also speaks about the scholarship of the Parsi communities at this point of time through the Assyrian antiquities. And he proclaimed them first as Layard's collection. But upon finding references to Rawlinson's gift within the Bombay Times of 1847, he changed his mind and declared them to be Rawlinson's slabs. Karkaria had also noted at that point in 1891 that none of our members, which is the Society's members, it seems knows anything about them. And only one gentleman, Mr. Cousins, he meant Henry Cousins, who was a superintendent of archaeological survey at that point of time, and he mentions him as an official of the archaeological survey, is aware of the archaeological value of the inscriptional content. However, since Cousins is not a member of the Society, he has not brought the matter before it. Karkaria's exposure drew attention to the archaeological survey, which administered the transference of these antiquities to the Prince of Wales when it opened its doors in 1922. Prince of Wales Museum is what I meant. So thus, from valued specimen of fine art, the antiquities of ancient Assyria came to represent only an archaeological collection. The donation history of the collection remains lost within the Prince of Wales Museum, or CSMVS, although the objects may all belong to Rawlinson Clark gift. We do not know. Now, if we go back to the story of Layard's missing marbles, it would be amiss to neglect a singular instance of the display of the Assyrian antiquities within Bombay in the Asiatic Society in July 1855. And this instance was Rawlinson, who came to the city, and he was invited by the Asiatic Society to give a presentation of his finds of Varka. He was then excavating at the site of Varka, and he spoke on the, and I quote him, researches and discoveries in Assyria and Babylonia. And he showed samples of objects for demonstrating the logic of his periodization, and his periodization went Chaldean, Assyrian, Babylonian in terms of the chronological progression. We know that the objects which Rawlinson had displayed were destined to the British Museum. In 1847, Rawlinson's gift to Bombay via Governor General Clark had comprised 10 fine slabs. The present Assyrian collections at the CSMVS comprises 12 pieces. Of them, 8 are from the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal II, and 3 from the palace of Tiglath-Pileser III, and 1 from the palace of Sargon III of Khorsabad. We are indeed tempted to ask, where did these 2 extra pieces of objects came from? Were they from Layard's cargo? We would not know. Now, I've just got briefly I would like to speak about what happened to the collections also in terms of history making of India, and this goes out of Bombay. Layard's excavations at Nimrud was recalled by the 2 most well-known 19th century field surveyors of ancient India, Alexander Cunningham and James Ferguson. In his Bhilsa topes, Cunningham had declared, "The bas-reliefs and inscriptions of the Bhilsa topes are almost equal in importance to the most splendid discoveries made by the enterprising, energetic Layard in the mounds of Euphrates." Yet, where Cunningham invoked Layard to aspire to the latter's status as amongst the pioneering British archaeologists of the Orient, Ferguson systematically used the antiquities of ancient Assyria for embellishing what he called a useful history of art and architecture that would allow, and I quote, "the British public a better standard by which to judge the merits of art and to create an art that will be worthy of the British nation and of the engaging and employing the highest class of intellects that exist amongst us." Ferguson stated, he styled himself as the pioneering architectural historian of India, and after his field surveys in India, which spanned from 1837 to 1842, he wrote the book Picturesque Hindustan, followed by this book, which is called An Historical Inquiry into the True Principles of the Beauty of Art, published in 1849, where he emphatically affirmed that even if we should not be able to decipher the inscription, the details of art will be suffice to point out the affiliation of almost all the primitive nations of Asia. Now, we know from Ferguson's work that he celebrated the feats of seeing the field as the producer of true evidence, which is something which all archaeologists do till today. However, Ferguson himself wrote, and I quote, for writing this history of ancient Assyria in this book, he said he had only seen a few plates from Botha and Layard's excavations, because Botha and Layard's excavations were actually rendered into drawing and sketches by George Schaff Jr. and George Flanagan, respectively. And he says he had seen these plates without either texts or plans or references of any sort that could make them intelligible. Yet, from the drawings, Ferguson concluded that, and I quote, "Notwithstanding its superior mode of phonetic utterance of the Assyrian sculpture marks a lower grade of civilization and of mind than the Egyptian." Now, Ferguson's next book was called The Palaces of Nineveh and Persepolis, and this actually prompted Layard to employ Ferguson to make the Nineveh court in the Crystal Palace at Sydenham, where this court, there are lots of histories for this, but it's an amalgam. It was a spectacular creation, and it was an amalgam of the Nineveh, the non-existent palaces of Nineveh at the top, and the non-existent palaces of Persepolis at the bottom, and the facade was brilliantly colored. And the colors represented Ferguson's fixed belief that the Assyrian people may have displayed a love of polychrome decoration and their palaces may have been gorgeously colored. So this frontispiece which you see was actually supervised by Ferguson, is what ancient Nineveh was supposed to look like. But, he said, quite noteworthily, the use of color by ancient Assyrians may not have always been in the best of taste. So but this is a person who actually talks about valid evidence through seeing. In the palaces of Nineveh and Persepolis, Ferguson also established the cultural geography of ancient Assyria as the historical corridor that connected Asia and Europe. And there's no slide for this because this is conceptual and he didn't produce a map for it, which is saying something. And he said that through this corridor, he traced two historical paths for the development of the arts within the world. One towards the supreme aesthetic achievements of the ancient Greek civilization, which he stated emerged from ancient Egypt and went via ancient Assyria, Asia Minor, the Etruscans, and the other of the architectural representations of the Hindus, and their monstrous, many-limbed and many idols and still more monstrous doctrines, obviously these are in quote, which ostensibly went via ancient Assyria and Persia into the Indian subcontinent. Through this history of this corridor, he declared, he challenged the antiquity, and I quote him, of the Sanskrit-speaking people and reminded his readers that because the language of this group, i.e. the Sanskrit-speaking people, is the only one studied, the literature in consequence is the only one known in Europe, so that they are generally, but most erroneously, looked upon as the only people of India. But he declared that even if the Brahmins had passed into India at too early a date and by too direct a route, the Vaishnav religion was certainly closely allied to the Assyrian. So too, he stated, were the Buddhists, who were closely allied to the Magian and came from the same fertile source. So, he denied primordiality, which is a very good thing, but the inferences and the interpretations all came from Assyria. Now, the absence of hard facts in Ferguson's theories of race and art is rather clear from the manner in which he demonstrated evidence of the reception of natural light in the palaces of Nineveh and Persepolis and the Mughal mosques and Muslim tombs in India. And I will not go into the details here, but he assumed stylistic similarities in the non-existing roofs of the Assyrian and Persian palaces, and I say non-existing because the roofs have never been discovered, and the roofs of the Muslim tombs in Ahmedabad and Bijapur, and the Mughal mosques in Delhi and Agra. And from all of this, he concluded that the mode of light is admitted between the rows of two columns and not placed in a solid wall. Through section drawings, these are his drawings, he showed the reality of his inferences in the book, and he concluded through the comparative study, and I quote here, the Asiatic mind was not capable of anything much higher than oscillating towards perfection which it never reached. The systematic method through which Ferguson derived his evidently visible evidence, and which he illustrated through the woodcuts, was however blatantly premised upon his inferences of the architectural shapes of non-existing buildings. So just to conclude, the histories of Nineveh in Bombay and of the imagination of Nineveh in Ferguson's Universal History of Art are contemporary in time. We are talking about the period between 1840s and 1860s. They both provide reasons for reflecting upon our acts of visualization through which we create notions of valid evidence, and we shape the ontology of the non-present past. This history also reveals the importance of regarding the connected histories that constitute the networks of exchanges between people and goods, and which informs us of the relational nature of economics, cultures, migrations, myths, and political ideologies. This history therefore prevails us to consider the inherently plural identity of all phenomenon, including objects. Additionally, in bringing home to us the creative uses of ancient civilizations for developing history lessons, the history also draws our attention to the important roles of museums and collections for informed scholarship of the histories of archaeologies and archaeology's public spaces, and for seeing the reasons for looking beyond the colonial governance for a more nuanced scholarship of 19th century India. They make it clear that the archaeological context of antiquity is just one of its many contexts, and not even the original one. And here I quote James Cuno. Many of you may have read this book. But perhaps more importantly, they convey the importance of maintaining a trans-regional and a transnational perspective even when we write local histories, be they of a specific event, a specific museum, a specific region, a specific archive, or a person. Thank you.
We'll take about 5 minutes of question and answers, and if anybody wants to ask a question, wait for the mic to come around, please.
No questions. I don't know. Do you have a question? Come on. I mean, this was just a history, and this history is out there, but it's something more. I mean, if I just egg you on to question this, because this history, it can just be a unique history, and we can forget about it. But one thing is when we talk. I mean, I'm passionately involved in thinking through histories of collections and thinking through histories of museum making, and that's probably because I come with a PhD in archaeology from a place here, from Deccan College, Pune, where we never actually looked at museums or objects or antiquities to think in terms of how we create and derive inferences. So historiography becomes important for me. Histories of collections becomes very important for me. And the kind of histories which we write about archaeology, which is linear, developmental, we realize that we lose many things on the way because we want to lose them. We don't want to carry them. So these give us a nuanced idea. But I would like, I mean, one of the reasons, and I thought, I had a different audience in mind, I guess, when I thought about this lecture, but I thought that these are, perhaps there are many more economic museums in India, and there are. I mean, I know about Secunderabad and Agra and places. We know nothing about their histories. There are probably, like Jaipur, I showed you all, just to show that what were the Nineveh objects doing on the walls, because the other walls of the Prince of Albert Museum has got, there's some morality story from China, there is some Egypt, and the entire thing is Ramayana of Akbar's Razamnama, which has been actually painted. And you wonder, how did these Nineveh objects, how did they look, how was information, how does information about antiquities get out? So this is archaeology's public spaces. I mean, apart from excavation reports, which only the initiated would read, how do these things get out? Because it's important now, especially in today's milieu, to think about how are these objects being interpreted, and especially when they say that this is the only meaning an object can hold. And the idea is to say that they resist interpretations. And this is in the larger field of material culture studies. This is what material culture studies is all about. So it's not only a history. So sorry, I mean, I have this teacher attitude of going on, but collections histories we really don't know very much about.
Sudeshna, I have a question. Thank you for the insights.
It is something interesting for us to know, because within the collection itself, we have a salient terracotta panel, which is massive,
Almost like 10 feet long.
Do you?
Yes, it's in storage. So that's what perhaps I think we should definitely look at it.
You have it here?
Yes.
One.
In one panel. It's massive.
Of terracotta or plaster cast?
Terracotta. It's definitely terracotta. Yes.
Okay.
And so we were also struggling with provenance, because that's where the problem arises, right? How did it land up here? And in fact, we're still digging at the records to find out, how these objects kind of very random. We have hand axes from Norfolk in this museum. Somaliland hand axes. So how do these?
Okay, so so this thing just showed you deliberately. That's why for people in the Bhauda Jilad is the Bombay Times and Journal
Yes,
of
yes.
Commerce. I just stumbled across
It's
this completely
perfect.
accidentally. Look through them. It's there in the ProQuest, as you
Yes.
saw in the
Yeah.
slide, and that was deliberately done just to show you all what it is. So the Assyrian objects, these things, Birdwood said they're the only finest specimen we have in the Economic Museum. But it's also important that you talk about Bhauda Jilad as a city museum. I think of Bhauda Jilad as an economic, natural museum,
Right.
which never
Right.
happened. Okay,
Absolutely.
so you have a prehistory here,
Right.
and because the Indians had paid for the Bhauda Jilad, so you have Shamir Sheikh Ji and you have
Right.
the Parsi businessmen and the Marwaris also, who actually paid quite a lot for this. The aim changed, and they said this would be the place where the Indians can go and stroll around the gardens and be educated
Yes.
through the industrial arts, of course. So that's why you have the link with the South Kensington Museum
Yes.
at the V&A. But you have the links with the old economic museum, and that link you cannot forget.
Very much.
And what is surprising and what is not surprising actually, because what could George Birdwood, when you think about your first case, as you enter the museum,
Yes.
are those sticks, there are those rocks and
Yeah.
stuff. Now tell me, what would George Birdwood have done had he only had that kind of stuff to ask the Indians to pay money for a building?
Nothing.
So what he actually, and he said, unfortunately we do not have fine carpets. Unfortunately we do not have woodwork. We must get woodwork from Songkhet. So somebody said, you cannot go there, that is not local for Bombay.
Yeah.
He actually used these foreign objects for the cause of a local museum. And you use the foreign objects for a cause of a local history. And Bombay then was an ascendant commercial city. I mean, you think about, if we go back to the history of textiles, for example, in Bombay, or the use of Japanese lacquer work in Bombay, this was a city very different from the rest of any city, even Calcutta. which was coming up to be this completely international port town where, that's why he said, a man learned in Jerusalem comes from. So you have Somalian. He actually asked for objects from the South Kensington to Henry Cole to send him stuff so that he could tout around for money for a building.
Yeah. Even prior to that, I mean, like when we were looking at George Buist, who's the first curator here, I mean, not at this museum, but the Museum of Economic History, like natural history, economic products, and things like that, was also collecting botanical samples as well as soil samples, which were there in the museum. We have no idea what happened then. We're still trying to track down.
See, in the British, I mean, I can tell you the history of the British museums because that's what I know most. But what happened is that they started building up these museums. So the Victorian Albert Museum's collections of things which came from here, the samples and all kinds of things, which went into the Geology Museum, which was established there in 1871. Okay. Here, you obviously have shared stuff with the Prince of Wales. So the Assyrian things went to the Prince of Wales.
Yes.
You would ask, why didn't the Somalian hand axes made there?
Yeah.
Perhaps they didn't know. But there is a huge amount of transactions between the various museums in Bombay. I do not know Bombay as a city at all. So I feel very hesitant in talking about Bombay and 19th century Bombay. But I would love to kind of get my hands onto some of the archives of the various museums within the city to see what happened.
In fact, even out of Bombay, we have records that the objects were sent to the Pune Museum, for example, the Mahatma Phule Museum, also the Nagpur Museum. So it's actually acted as, in a sense, like the Mother Museum, which was sending objects out from its own collection.
Yeah.
A lot of archaeological exhibits from here went to the Prince of Wales when it was
But
established.
Tucker College, as I call it, has got archaeology collection from CSMBS.
And the other,
it
that's
happens in
just one
archives.
aspect. I was also keen to understand what's your view on the plaster casts, because that's something which is even the V&A has this massive Trojan columns, which are in the plaster casts. Yeah. So why these things?
Yeah. So I mean, my first job was at the V&A. I worked at the V&A first. The plaster casts amongst art historians were always considered as copy. And that's why I keep on saying, I emphasize the fact that I worked with photographs for so long. Because photographs amongst archaeology, as you know, are not considered objects. They are just representations of something on the ground. That's not true. A photograph, if you look at it, I mean, it's got the image there, but it's got information at the back, which actually creates histories. And that's been, a lot of my work has been that. Plaster casts, there was a conference here in Bombay by the K.R. Kama Design, where I actually spoke about the plaster casts. Because every international exhibitions from 1851 onwards has produced these huge amounts of plaster casts. And as you all know better than I do, that all the plaster casts of the Sanchi Torana, the Gwalior Gate, the Baroda screen, they all went to the V&A. I mean, many of them went to the V&A. And they were, as Debbie would say, Deborah Solo would say, some of them were also hidden from view. They've never been thought about. But as you can think about the life history of these plaster casts, so I'll tell you what I found yesterday. And this is the plaster casts I discovered only in January. I just went to the library and looked up, and there were these plaster casts. What I know from the museums, yesterday I went through the annual reports, what I know from the K.R. Commerce Institute thing is that they say it's a firm in London which has made the plaster casts. That firm could have been in Bombay for all I know. I cannot vouch for the fact that the plaster casts were used within the city, but they are massive. And if the obelisk road is anything to go by, then these plaster casts must have been shown, if not in the town hall, maybe outside, maybe how it was done. I mean, in the V&A, we only know about the story of the plaster casts being shown inside the museum. But there is a whole story of these plaster casts when they went, I mean, these plaster casts made, for the various ones, they made these different courts, like the Nineveh court, the Indian courts have the plaster casts. They were actually shown within the city. And they were used by artists and craftsmen to think about their design. So plaster casts have got a very rich history which needs to be explored. And in this book of objects and histories, there is Samudragupta's, you all know his gold coin with the veena, where he's playing the veena. There's a huge plaster cast of that gold coin in the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Okay, huge. which is on the walls of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, with Kumaragupta, Skandagupta, Chandragupta's first and Chandragupta second. All the important Gupta kings. What was Gupta? Golden age of ancient India. What is it doing in the Rashtrapati Bhavan? Doing the golden age story there. Where was it made? And that's very important. It was made in 1952, presented to Rajendra Prasad by K.M. Munshi. Now, I don't want to get into K.M. Munshi's history, but you can see the kind of historiography which is created in the making of it, made by a Muslim craftsman whose name does not appear in the labels. So, plastic, and so I'm slowly, working on objects. It's not so much objects I'm interested in. Actually, when we talk about life histories, plaster casts get a very, very important life. And so if there were, where is this obelisk? And I have found 5 plaster casts, which to me looked absolutely Assyrian, which I showed you. There are 2 in the Kama Institute. One I think looks Roman. I don't think it's the same period. And one is of an Egyptian pharaoh. And in Dr. Modi's room, Dr. Nawaz Modi's room, who's the head, there's a small little figure. Could be an Assyrian, cannot be. But the 5 I showed you, today I showed them. In a way, Layard's drawings are there. They're definitely from there. So, so you see, the Asiatic Society said, few of us can go to the British Museum, we need it here. So they were showing it. But were they showing it in Bombay?
Also, just thinking about your saying ways of seeing and how color is translated, because in the frontispiece you have these beautiful imaginative colored palaces, right? The plaster casts are white, and there's been some interesting archaeological work on how in the Victorian period Greco-Roman sculptures were considered these white, kind of pure.
So think about David.
You know, yes.
Marble statue, white and pure.
Huge plastic.
Yeah. So you can think about it, our temple stuff, like how they conserved all the temples without them to give it a color. But we know from the text that these temples were colored. I mean, all our temples were what the Britishers would say garishly colored.
Yes.
But that is exactly the criticism Layard faced after Ferguson faced from Layard after the Nineveh court. Layard was really pissed off for the color because the Nineveh court was the only court which was colored. And in all, but the point here is, there was also the whole thing about the picturesque. The way they colored these Asian monuments was not the color they used for the European stuff. So, and Layard had no evidence, none at all, to talk about color. And that is quite interesting because Layard, he was also somebody who that's why I was reading those things about inscriptions. Not Layard, sorry, Ferguson. Ferguson said architecture historians don't need to look at text. You just look at the architecture and you can actually classify buildings according to periods and chronologies. And he did that. And his classification of the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain is what we still use today. And things like Khajuraho is ugly. Khajuraho is we do it in Deccan College, is the declining stage of the best of Hindu architecture. Sanchi is the pristine, is the best which we have. But these, at least Alexander Cunningham could read inscriptions. He could read the coin legends. Ferguson could not. He never bothered. But this is a man who says, I see, and therefore this is what it is. He does this entire thing about race, and his race history is quite pernicious. And he does his whole history of ancient Assyria by just looking at a couple of plates. So, which comes to the thing, and we are talking about casts, photographs, etc. Archaeologists use plates in their excavation reports, and they put the plates in such a way so that your eye is directed to see what you want them to see. And you create evidence like that. And as I was talking to Ruta and you all, that despite the fact that we put so much emphasis about how a trench has to be excavated with precision, with drawings, our inferences bear very little to the technical perfection which we use for the trenches, apart from saying that this has come from a stratigraphy, this has come from the level. But the inferences we make about the society has got no bearing upon the way we plot those sites. So we never ask ourselves the questions, why did so-and-so go and dig that site and not that site? Why did they invest so much time about the Neolithic and not the medieval? Those questions probably we are asking today, but the whole notion of creating inferences in archaeology, because I come from archaeology, it's like ingrained in my head, is about evidence. So how the hell do we create valid evidence? So stories like this actually give us some kind of a plank to build up the understanding that valid evidence, the notion of what is considered a valid evidence, that changes to generation, but my parents thought this evidence is not what I think could be is sufficient or valid or whatever it will be used. And evidence is how this evidence is what is created. It bears upon heritage. Okay, anyway.